Now, David, it's very important to me with regard to these photo collages that we keep reaching for new heights and trying to outdo each subsequent one. How are you this morning, this afternoon, or the time zone there?
Yeah,
Morning
no,
in
I'm well,
Canada.
Jason. It's good to be with you.
Yes, morning in Canada, afternoon in New York. I always sort of say that. Good to be with you, David. It's really astounding how you and I sort of started down this road of examining various technologies, things in the patent office, and then people sort of come out of the woodwork to complain about the things that we say. Of course, we invite anyone to participate in the crowdsource investigation process that we're engaged in here, but we want to avoid false information, fake news injects, if you will, and all of that. What have you prepared for us to discuss today, David?
Well, thank you. You start with some interesting terms, fake news injects. And people talk about fake news, but not so much about the notion of maliciously injecting fake news and media plays. And of course, I think now many of our regular listeners, and hopefully many new ones, will understand that one of the leading proponents of fake news injects and media plays is the British company Serco. And it does this as a service for governments around the world, but in particular the United Kingdom government at a place called Hawkers in the UK, on the basis that they will actually borrow a government network, an entire government network, and inject fake news or media plays into the network of some hypothetical or simulated emergency, earthquakes. Well, there are not too many of those in the United Kingdom, of course, but let's say riots and fires, and then train or groom or coach the top officials. Hence, many of these exercises, particularly those run by Booz Allen and Hamilton, are defined as top-off exercises. And top-off is a nice euphemism because, of course, it could describe top-off, i.e. the decapitation of the state. But perhaps I digress. Anyway, so Serco is capable of putting on very realistic exercises, borrowing government networks, and in fact, a great concern to the United States of America is one of Serco's biggest clients is the American government. And so Serco is able to project a simulated exercise into the United States. Probably has been able to, since its original name was RCAGB 1929, has been able to project simulated exercises into the United States since World War II. Over to you.
Well, it causes me to think about War of the Worlds, that very famous broadcast on the radio from Orson Welles, where everybody thought it was an actual Martian invasion because Orson Welles had done such a good job of creating this dramatization of an attack by Martian life forms on the planet Earth. And I think that was in the 30s, if it was a radio drama, but it's important to remember that viewers were not that sophisticated back then, so you could see how somebody might be tricked. When I went to NYU Film School, they always told us about how the Lumiere brothers invented the cinematograph, which was the first motion picture projection, and they told us that people who saw the movie of a train pulling into the station actually ran out of the theater for fear that they would be struck by a train. And I always found it ridiculous, but I actually integrated it into some of my lectures about stereoscopic filmmaking and directing, because you need to put yourself into the mind of a person in 1895. They had never seen a motion picture before. The technology was totally foreign to them, and everything inside their, instinctual reptilian brain told them, get out of here, you're in danger. The visual, the motion, the sound, all that. I don't know if they had sound back then, but the point is, I have come to believe that people really were frightened by that imagery. And what I would tell the people who I was lecturing, the directors, etc., was that stereoscopic 3D motion pictures added an element of realism that tapped into the viewer's subconscious mind. So it's important that we really consider how these different exercises could frighten people. When you see things on the news, you're conditioned to accept that in a different way than if you're watching it in the cinema or that's some, a Star Wars film or something like that. So we've seen a lot of these different companies that stage these events, these resilience testing, and it does involve integrating fake news people, right?
Well, absolutely. And of course, going on to my storyboards in the hope that one day we'll be able to install virtual reality theater in post-secondary institutions for a very specific purpose, where students can ground truth the claims of their teachers. Because I think both you and I are starting to understand that there are good teachers and bad teachers, that there are grey hat teachers and there are black hat teachers and there are white hat teachers. And there's a whole group of people with a different agenda. But amongst the bad teachers, in my opinion, is you have people who have access to vast amounts of money through the pension funds. And there are two big pension funds that you and I have talked about at length, with the University Superannuation Scheme in the United Kingdom, with I think about £50 billion under management, and the Teachers, TIAA, Teachers Insurance Annuity Association of America in the United States, which is the world's largest private pension fund, with over $1 trillion of assets under management. And unfortunately for America, on the morning of 9/11, the representatives from those two pension funds, which were and are shareholders in Serco, were on the 47th floor meeting with other Serco shareholders, which would include the government of Saudi Arabia, which of course is supposed to be the source of the mussel hijackers that came from Al Qasim province and went through Dubai to get their visas, unfortunately, from Serco, right? Because Serco has run the United States National Visa Center since 1994 in a decision taken presumably with a great deal of forethought by President Clinton, or presumably that's a contradiction in terms. I think the guy's got a span of attention of a gnat. But anyway, moving on. So you have these two teachers' pension funds, let's say $1.5 trillion of assets under management, huge shareholdings in companies like Boeing, which of course is a major player on the Federal Bridge Certification Authority network, meeting with representatives from another shareholder, the only state of the shareholders, which is California, and of course you've got the potential for some very interesting financial transactions on the morning of 9/11, which would involve, let's say hypothetically, the triggering of a catastrophe bond, which would allow sponsors to make a killing, literally and physically, if both of the towers came down on the same day through fire. Over to you.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, David, maybe initially were doubtful about this concept of people making money on 9/11 through catastrophe bonds and insurance frauds and things like that. But it seems like in the 18 years since 9/11 occurred, there have been so many other events that also seem to match that pattern, like, of course, the October 1st, 2017 shooting in Las Vegas. There are lots of reports of people shorting the stock for MGM Entertainment and doing all kinds of things that seem to indicate foreknowledge of the event and certainly the desire and ability to make money from it.
Yeah, you're right. And so I think it's worth just summarizing, I would guess, the total assets under management of the shareholders of Serco, predominantly from teachers, let's say the pension funds, the intellectual elite in the United Kingdom and the United States, and the global custodians, which are 10 major banks, including BNY Mellon and Northern Trust. Northern Trust being the alien property custodian during World War I and World War II, and for all I know, World War III. All right, let's pray that it's not about to happen. But the alien property custodian with Northern Trust is based in Chicago, which is a very interesting place to hold the intellectual property of your enemies. And of course, that begs the question, as far as the teachers are concerned, who are their enemies? Over to you.
Well, David, I think a strong argument could be made that World War III actually began on September 11th, 2001. But, before we go too much further, maybe we should talk about some of the different individuals depicted in today's photo collage. You and I have gotten into really kind of a groove with these things. We really are kind of creating them in the days leading up to each show and putting them together in such a way that they kind of tell the story of what we talk about each time. Where would you like to begin in this image?
Well, let's go to the bottom left tunnel, and we have the man in red that we've described for this show as the leader of the red team. Now, I wasn't familiar with that notion of red team leader in respect of hackers. But over on that left-hand wall, you've got a poster of the three types of hackers most conventionally understood. The black hat hacker, the gray hat hacker, and the white hat hacker. And the white hat hacker is generally considered to be the person acting with the authority of the client on testing the vulnerabilities of the client's network, and presumably, if they're effective and efficient and capable, and unfortunately, I personally, although I'm not an expert in his domain, as he points out frequently, he thinks, anyway, let's not make it personal. I mean, my great problem, and I think you and I have discussed this, if you're an ethical hacker, and let's say you are potentially negligent, reckless, willful, or in the worst case, fraudulent, you might leave the door open into your client's network where smarter people than you or more evil people than you come in behind and actually can structure it so that it looks like you a malicious hacker instead of being an ethical hacker. What I would basically say, there's an identity crisis amongst the hacker community, because once you've been a gray hacker or a black hacker or a white hacker, and then you go into a different role in a different company, I think your head would explode if you were asked, well, what the hell are you doing, inside the Nortel master server in 1991 when one Julian Assange in Melbourne was hacking into that server. And then in 1993, he was able to use his hacking skills to uncover a pedophile network in Victoria, but I digress. So back over on the left, you've got some very interesting characters standing behind the red team leader. We have Mr. Robert Mueller, who was the director of the FBI, who I think was sworn in on the 4th or 5th of September of 2000.
The 4th, I believe, yeah. 1 week before. Exactly 1 week before.
Well, 1 week before. Very critical. His predecessor, Louis Frey, had resigned. And Louis Frey was Opus Dei, and I don't know a lot about Opus Dei, but apparently they used to put a string of barbed wire around their upper thigh to prevent getting erections in the vicinity of prostitutes, or maybe
what is this? Opus Dei? I'm not familiar with that.
Opus Dei, it's a Jesuit sort of sect.
Wearing barbed wire on their leg?
Yes. Now, of course, that I'm not absolutely certain, but I will suggest that Boston Corbett, apparently, he was the man who shot John Wilkes Booth, who shot, or is alleged to have shot, Abraham Lincoln. Huh. And this is it's a segue that's rather a big reach, but what he did is he got upset with himself for getting an erection in the vicinity of prostitutes, so he cut his testicles off. So obviously there's sexual issues there, but Opus Dei, I'm sure they're a bona fide and highly credible outfit, but Louis Frey is a member of Opus Dei, and for whatever reason in May of 2001 he resigned as FBI director. Now that left a huge gap in May of 2001, between May of 2001 and September the 11th, when the head of the FBI was waiting, till the 4th of September of 2001. There was no head of the FBI to look at the big picture as the threat began to emerge of an Al-Qaeda attack. Now, if we go back to that left-hand tunnel, we'll see some people who must have had a very good idea of the Al-Qaeda preparations for the attack, because you have Mr. General Alexander Haig is in the middle there. And General Alexander Haig was interviewed at 9 o'clock on the morning of 9/11 with the camera, I think it was Fox News, trained on the north face of the North Tower to look at that very convincing Hollywood-style gash of a plane ghosting through steel columns, and he was asked who he think was behind it. This is 2 minutes before the second plane hit the south face of the South Tower, and he says, Alexander Haig says, well, I don't want to speculate, but I think we know where to look, at either the Palestinian or bin Laden groups. How about that for a forensic brain? I mean, the second plane hasn't hit. He's looking at a fairly persuasive hole that something hit the north face of the North Tower, and he zeroes straight away into the theory that the bin Laden group was behind it. And that's interesting because he was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and there's a major logistics base for NATO in Luxembourg. And it's my
David,
belief.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you remind me that when I was working with George Webb, he would frequently speak about his brother's time in Luxembourg, and like sometimes George's brother would be kind of friendly towards George, and sometimes he would be antagonistic. And George had this sort of countermeasure where he would say, oh, well, when Dave says this, I'll say NATO generals. Tell us about the NATO generals. And I don't know what they were talking about, but Dave certainly would get pretty upset about that. And I mean, again, we're not accusing any of these Swigert guys of anything, except when they directly lie about us. I'll accuse them of lying about us, which they've done frequently. But we don't know that they were involved in any of this stuff. I'm just making commentary on things that they've said. You know, Dave has told us he's been in Nicaragua. He's told us about his sleeping arrangements that his father imposed upon him with canine excrement. He's told us that he's an expert in public key infrastructure, and he worked for this Euro sign card thing. This was March 15th, 2001. Wow, that's kind of a few months before September 11th. Luxembourg-based Euro sign card is to incorporate time stamping technology from Chicago's DigiStamp. Did we know about this before, David?
I think we did. It's really just falling into place because what our philosophy has become is you have to, in order to analyze a crime scene, you need to restore the timestamps to see that cause precedes effect. You can't have an effect preceding a cause. And of course, it's a great maneuver if you don't want to be convicted or intercepted at a crime scene. If you can take the data from the crime scene and strip off the time and location stamp from that data, which is easy to do with X509, which is the standard protocol for public key infrastructure that was introduced. I think it was introduced by Nortel in 1988. If you can strip off the data that contains the time and the location and move that through a privileged group of, let's say, a white list of teachers, you can actually deprive or deny the police, the FBI, and their equivalent in the UK, the opportunity to solve the crime because they can't patch the timestamps back into the cause and effect. So I think that little trio there, or quadrain, if that's the right word, in the tunnel on the left is very important. Excuse me, because you could have Mr. Swigert using technology like some of the patents we've looked at, including the split tunnel technology, working with former General Supreme Allied Commander, Mr. General Haig.
Alexander Haig, yeah.
Yeah, and then, of course, you've got the guy on his left, which is a most sinister figure. Both Haig and Shalikashvili are dead. But John Shalikashvili was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was sent by Bill Clinton, one of the evil teachers, to Beijing to give a presentation to the People's Liberation Army generals at the military university in Beijing. And this guy, at the end of his transcripted speech, that may have been scrubbed, he said, I've been instructed by my president, Bill Clinton, to leave behind details of all America's weapons programs in the interests of world peace. Well, please, Americans that are listening to us, surely one must understand that if the President of the United States sends the former chairman, or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, to Beijing to give America's defense secrets to the communist Chinese, then he's a traitor.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, we know about Chinagate. We know that Bill Clinton released secrets. There was that guy, Charlie Tree, who was somehow financing his campaign. I want to take you back to these NATO generals for a second, because it does remind me, there's been some people sending me information that the Sweigerts are, particularly speaking about us, making videos about us. I mean, we're talking about them, but I didn't know David Zweigert until he started making his taunting videos after I started working with his brother. His brother told me about his time in Luxembourg, something that gets him pretty upset about these NATO generals. And it takes me back to this ethical hacking. Of course, we all know that David Zweigert wrote this book, The Certified Ethical Hackers Field Operations Guide. He's an author, he's an expert in this industry. So certainly remarking on this work, it's a publicly available book. It's something worth talking about. I think the concept of an ethical hacker, David, it's a little bit complicated just on its face, because, let's say you're a military man, you've got a career in the Air Force, and a NATO general instructs you to do something. Well, is it ethical or unethical to follow that order or not follow that order, even if the order is do something that's going to result in lots of people dying? You sort of have to follow the orders, and many people would say that insubordination in the military is unethical, right?
Well, totally, and that's a great problem for the United States of America in terms of reverse engineering the crimes of 9/11, and it should never have been called a terrorist event. It was a criminal event, except that the criminal organization was global. It just followed the career of General John Shalikashvili. After coming back from Beijing, having given all of America's weapons secrets to the communist Chinese, which would have prepared them for a very active role on what is now called EduRome, or the Northwestern University IT partnerships, they could have actively participated in some of the frauds, the financial frauds of 9/11, for example, the catastrophe bond. But just going back to Shalikashvili, when he comes back, he gets a gig as a director of Boeing. Now just think about that. So the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's handed off America's weapons secrets to the communist Chinese, right, now joins Boeing. What kind of pressure does he put on Boeing that might result in Boeing headquarters being moved from Washington, D.C., where they've been beside the production plant forever?
No, it's Washington State.
Sorry, yes, Washington State. Because, again, flippantly, people thought that I might have a great career in the oil industry working for Schlumberger, and I might go all the way to the top. But let's say, hypothetically, I was the chairman or chief executive officer of Boeing Aircraft, and someone had said to me, we'd like to move your headquarters office to Chicago. I would say, no way, Jose. I mean, you've got to be near the production facility, because that's where the errors, the mistakes, the lack of morale, possibly saboteurs, that's where they concentrate, right? In World War II, I believe Obama's grandmother, I think that's right, was working on a Boeing production line.
Really? Wow.
In Washington
I didn't
State.
know that.
So let's just say, hypothetically, Obama's grandmother was a communist. Well, why wouldn't you put a saboteur inside Boeing's production line? That's where the kind of the action is, if you will. So when Shalikashvili comes back to the United States after his trip to China, handing off America's weapons secrets, he then goes to work as a director of Boeing, maybe others, of course, and someone pressurizes Boeing to move its headquarters from Washington State to Chicago, and it's commissioned on the same day that Robert Mueller is sworn in as director of the FBI. And I hear the drum of death, because what's underway now is a whole bunch of insiders, probably on that teacher's whitelist of insiders, getting access to the timestamp data that would allow them to place a cat bond bet that would pay off in spades, right? You've got the drum of death because these insiders, whether they're white hats wearing gray suspenders or gray hats, wearing white suspenders. I think they're all so confused. They don't actually know what's ethical and what's not. Over to you.
Well, I mean, beyond knowing what's ethical and what's not, I think we've identified a sort of inherent philosophical conflict in the concept of a white hat hacker at all. This notion of ethical hacking, it inherently requires a definition of what is ethical. Let's say in their infinite wisdom, these NATO generals or whoever else is, pulling the strings that run the world and do whatever, let's say they've decided that for the greater good, they need to get into these endless wars in the Middle East. They need to provoke that by convincing the public at large that this is in America's interest and we're in danger. And in order to achieve that provocation, they hatch a plan to destroy the World Trade Center. And you talk about Obama and communists, it causes me to think about two people who I didn't know about until you told me, but Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, who mentored Michelle Obama at the Sidley Austin law firm in Chicago years after their Days of Rage protests, where they openly stated that they wanted to destroy the United States. They wanted to re-educate the entire population, and they anticipated there would be at least 25 million people who would not be re-educated, who would resist, perhaps in the way, David, that you and I are resisting by trying to share this information with everyone. And they had planned on destroying as many as 25 million Americans. So certainly 3,000 on 9/11 fits right into their plan, doesn't it?
Oh, totally. And of course, destroying, that's a euphemism for killing, right? Now, whether these were in concentration camps or gas chambers or, the use of biological weapons like the anthrax bacillus that was spread around after 9/11, where Robert Mueller was supposed to be sending a FBI investigation team to Portendown in the United Kingdom to determine whether or not the scientists there had smuggled out some anthrax through the Boscombe Down Airport, which is run by Kinetic, which is the social engineering outfit, British social engineering outfit in the United States, and brought the bacillus over to the United States, mixed it up with what is known as sabotage spore powder to increase the dispersivity of this material. So the people who opened those envelopes containing the bacillus after 9/11 attack, they got inhalation anthrax, which is a particularly virulent and violent and difficult thing to cure. So most of them died. So going back to the right-hand tunnel, if we look up against the wall there, we have this incredible facility for revocation of certificates that would allow, let's say, the blue team in the exercises of 9/11 to respond properly to the threatened attack and the imminent attack and the actual attack. Now, very interestingly, on 9/11, it turns out there was what is known as a continuity of government exercise.
Right.
Now, the main supplier or provider of those exercises in the United States would be Booz Allen and Hamilton. And if I understand correctly from the Swigart rant, I call it rant because there's so many videos coming out of this man. Predominantly, you have the podgy finger waving and that prepper kitty.
He's eating too many chicken wings, David.
Yeah, right. So anyway, the problem for Swigart in his role as an ethical hacker is to work out what he might do to stop the threat of someone getting onto the federal bridge and revoking the certificates of the people who are needed to respond in a certain way. Let's say in the Pentagon, Captain Gerald DeConto, the duty officer of the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center, and 125 of his colleagues who were all obliterated on 9/11, how they should be responding to or protected against a switch through the NATO, let's say hypothetically, AWACS machine from simulation of a continuity of government exercise to live fire. That is to say, the good guys at Boeing are stood down because they want their equipment to be defended. But within Boeing, it's courtesy of Christine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister, she's the chief operating officer of the Small Business Administration on 911. So she has at her disposal a loan portfolio of thousands and thousands of small business 8A companies or protege companies embedded with contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and the Boeing company.
Right.
And I'm not casting aspersions on these disadvantaged owners of these protege companies, but if you look at what is deemed to be disadvantaged by the evil teachers, it's if you're anything other than white and Caucasian. So basically, based on sexual orientation or ethnicity or faith, you can get your loan right from a bank that is part of the Small Business Administration loan program, and literally no question asked. In fact, in January of 2001, Christine Marcy proudly announced the accelerated loan guarantee program because the lending banks were complaining that they couldn't get the guarantee in place quickly enough.
Yeah.
So she brought it down to 60 minutes, which means
Doesn't seem like you can check out the loan applicant very thoroughly in 60 minutes.
Right. So what that means is Chinese ethnicity or South Vietnamese or whatever owned small businesses under the Small Business Administration could literally put in a request for a loan and have it granted through the guarantor within 60 minutes, which would actually give you time to apply for the loan right before takeoff of a hijacked plane, right? To test the ability of the Pentagon to defend itself against an attack from an aircraft that switched from foe in an exercise to friend, which is what happened to Captain Gerald DeConto. He realized that the incoming weapons platform was transmitting friend, that the missile battery on the roof of the Pentagon had been disabled. He gets on the phone or whatever it was to Gordon England, the Secretary of the Navy, asking for permission to override the missiles, and Gordon England stalls on him. So the United States of America lost the Pentagon U.S. Navy Command Center and 125 of its expert staff, and I think to forget about that is unforgivable, and Americans shouldn't forget about it, and I believe with a little help from our friends, Jason, we'll make sure that they don't forget it, and they find out who took out Captain Gerald DeConto and 125 of his American colleagues. Over to you.
Yeah, it was obviously a gigantic tragedy, and you know, what you're saying about these loan applications in an hour, David, it certainly seems like sort of a new process that would inherently rely on technologies in order to be able to do that kind of accelerated loan approval. And I just wonder, again, we don't know anything about that process in terms of the details, the systems that are used to achieve those loans, but it just smacks of being ripe for all kinds of technological frauds. And I just want to take you back to the Federal Bridge for a moment, David, because there's been a lot of talk about it over the past week or so. And people have criticized you and I for not being experts in public-private key infrastructure, not knowing what this federal bridge is. They allege that we claim someone used this federal bridge to hack a Boeing aircraft. They want to have Boeing bring a lawsuit against us. We're certainly not saying that. And you know, they also want Certipath to bring a lawsuit against us for using this image. I do want to thank Chris, I guess Negrini is his name, for giving me his personal permission to use this graphic in our various explorations of these technologies. In my conversation with the founder of Certipath, he instructed me that the Federal Bridge is a certificate issuing authority that is essentially a network of trust that allows these different entities to, you know, the analogy that he made, he said it's kind of like a credit card processor, but that analogy falls down. He likened it to, you know, in the sense of any of these companies, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, etc. Let's think about it in terms of a card key that gives you access to a door, or some sort of password that gives you access to sensitive computer network information in any of these companies. Well, certainly, David, if you were John Shally Cashfully walking into the Boeing company, it stands to reason that you'd have some sort of card access that, as the CEO, would give you access to almost everything in the company, whereas if someone were just the janitor scrubbing up after Mr. Shelley Cashfully, you might only have access to the janitor closet and the lobby in certain limited areas. Now, if someone was a certified hacker, ethical or not, the question we're asking is, could that person, if they had particular expertise in public-private key infrastructure, could that person in some way hack this network? And by hack, I'm including social engineering hacks, which could be fooling someone. I'm including spoofing some sort of access certificate that grants you access, in my analogy, to the building, in another possible analogy, to a sensitive, classified network within the Boeing organization. And the question then becomes, once you utilize some kind of unauthorized access to the Federal Bridge public key infrastructure, could you then access sensitive classified networks that would allow you to do or enable others to do things with technologies of those companies? Maybe those things could include making changes to the MCAS system in 737 MAX 8 aircraft, or anything. Once you have access to an area that is normally only granted to authorized personnel, if someone unauthorized obtains that access, there's no telling what could be done. Am I right in this analogy?
Yeah, totally. And so that's very important, because with the knife-wielding terrorist attack on London Bridge, when the truck was driven over various people, immediately the British intelligence authorities or whatever, they would have put out a request for any information on the source of funding of these terrorists. And it turns out that the Treasury people responsible for that, they found that their certificates had been revoked. So you've got this classic opportunity for an unethical hacker, a malicious hacker, a gray, red, blue, green hacker who probably has serious identity crisis. I mean, other than knowing that he's got a pudgy finger and a ring on it, I mean, like, where does he belong in the moral universe as far as the United States protection is concerned? But the people at Treasury were locked out of their systems, and they were unable to identify or help to identify the source of funds for the killers on the London Bridge, which they're not terrorists, they're criminals. So you've got a criminalized network that may have set out with great expectations or plans. And if you just go over to that right-hand side again, the right tunnel, you've got these very interesting characters with the backdrop of the Federal Bridge. And down on the ground, poking his hands up, is this guy Podesta. Now, I remember reading as a teenager The Migration of Symbols. I forget who wrote it book, but it seemed very interesting at the time. You've got the number 14 and the fish. Down on the ground there, you've got the gun wielded by Mr. Tarrant in the mosque in New Zealand, in Christchurch. And it's got 14s and fishes over it. And I think that's an interesting area for research, is to see if these people have their kind of internal dirty handshakes or special handshakes or rituals at initiation or hazing ceremonies for students, which potentially out at the pig farm, where they're put into a situation which is so hideous, so embarrassing, that they'd rather die than betray the confidence of the people who put the initiation ceremony together, which might include Mendenhalling, a senior public servant in the United States, before she goes on to become the chief operating officer of the Small Business Administration on 911. But just Googling up, not Googling up, if you scroll up to the picture of the tower.
Well, wait, David, before we move off of this, I want to focus on that for a second, because this 14 and fish in John Podesta's hand, the link to various symbols and numbers painted on Brendan Tarrant's gun in New Zealand. John Podesta, of course, was in New Zealand just a couple days before the attack in Christchurch, talking about the New Zealand election being a ripe target for hackers to manipulate. I believe this network of criminals that we're describing are very, very reliant on steganographic messaging. And by that I mean steganography, encoding messages in plain view. So if John Podesta puts a picture like this on Instagram and he says, oh, we were just having a fun party at the office and somebody drew a fish and a 14 on my hand, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But we have to remark about the coincidence of this symbol that definitely resembles the fish on his hand to some degree. We can't see it in this sort of crude two-dimensional representation of the gun, but when people who are outside of New Zealand are able to view the video, you can see 14s painted all over this gun. And it's interesting, the aggressive nature with which the Mendenhall phrase has been scrubbed from the Christine Marcy Washington Post article that you and I have spoken about many times. And, you know, it's interesting because, again, I knew nothing about Christine Marcy. I have nothing against Christine Marcy. Your former associate, Field McConnell, told us about her. It's his sister. He said that she's evil. I'm taking him at his word. I've offered Christine Marcy many opportunities to come on the show and defend herself and countermand anything that her brother has said. Certainly there could be a number of defenses. It's notable that this article written by the unfortunately now deceased Judy Mann from August 8th, 1979, all about Christine Marcy being a high-level executive in the government and a mother. I found out that Judy Mann was actually herself very into women's empowerment and feminism. She wrote quite a bit about the marginalization of women in the professional world, so it makes sense that she would write this article about Christine Marcy. It was odd, though, because you and I had looked at it so many times on the WashingtonPost.com, and it had a lot of typos, which seems strange for such a well-known and highly respected newspaper. It said Christine Mary had her first chili, and it's been changed on March 25th, 2019. Now, David, who do you presume would change that? Someone in Poland has accused you and I of tampering with this article. I did not have anything to do with this getting changed. I was quite shocked to see that.
I wouldn't even know how to begin, although I do understand that OCR, optical character recognition technology, that wouldn't have been available back in 1979 is available now. So maybe it's an artifact of the optical character recognition. But optical character recognition wouldn't convert Mendenhall to Christine Marcy. Right?
Exactly.
Someone has got in there and physically wanted to remove that. And that's back to this interesting word scrubbing. Now, the word scrub occurs in that patent application for the split tunnel activity. And my understanding of the patent basically would suggest that if you've got a crime scene and you want to make sure that insiders can benefit from the crime scene, let's say by buying insurance on someone who's about to get whacked, then you need to strip off the timestamp and location stamp from the data that would tell the police that there was a possibility of a contract killing and an insurance policy to finance it. And you strip that off to, well, what the language of the patent is what is called a whitelist. And I hadn't heard of that term, but I think you apparently are aware of it. A whitelist of insiders. They could benefit greatly from having access to the timestamp and the location stamp of data acquired or collected at the crime scene where the police are deprived access. Right? So they can't solve the crime, but the whitelist of insiders can profit from it. Now, what that does is leave a gap and a thirst, if that's the right word, for justice amongst we the people, what they would describe as the peasants. So there needs to be a whole community of people out there engaged to scrub or filter data flowing to or from websites that they deem to be objectionable. So I guess to a certain extent it's rather flattering, Jason.
Well, there's been such an aggressive play to try to scrub this information from the internet, David, and I can only say that their own activities draw attention to themselves. To accuse you and I of somehow falsifying this evidence, of somehow you and I making up this newspaper article that's talking about Mendenhall's baby was due in early August. I mean, someone has contacted the Washington Post and insisted that this thing must be changed to say
Scrubbed,
Marcy's
yes.
baby. Scrubbed it. They've scrubbed Mendenhall from the WashingtonPost.com, and someone's going to have to look at the original microfilm publication of the newspaper, which is very difficult to get compared to the online version, to see what it actually said. And what this indicates to me is that there's a very, very strong motivation to hide this type of steganographic messaging. We see it a lot with the number 33 as well. I hope people will focus on how frequently the number 33 shows up in articles about terrorist attacks, different types of really unusual things in the news. It's strange. I've come to notice it as a cue, perhaps to, as you've said, the insiders, the whitelist, the people in the know. And there was another point where I was working with Quinn Michaels, who had identified the book My Friend Mr. Leakey, which was just replete with steganographic messaging, and the same people that we're talking about got really upset that we were making videos about this children's book from 1937 or something like that. Didn't make a lot of sense to me at the time, David.
Yeah, well, that's right. So now this is the dilemma of the hackers. Eventually, as you move through that world, maybe sometimes you're a gray hat, sometimes you're a white hat, sometimes you're a black hat, and sometimes you have a red team leader, which is internet slang for the leader of the white hats. But what happens if you're a gray hat being led by the nose by the red team leader, right? Or a black hat? So, and I think eventually the red team leader's head must explode, figuratively, of course, because he doesn't know whether his team is loyal to him or leaking stuff out of the back door that will expose him one day to some pretty serious consequences. Because I believe overall what they've created is, with the shareholders of Serco, 10 global custodians with $100 trillion of assets under management, is a global patent for rent, murder for hire network, where if death results and American law applies, the people involved in that, if they're using or traveling or inducing the victim to use or travel in interstate or foreign commerce for the purposes of murder for hire, and death results, then they're looking at life imprisonment or the death sentence. So I think the people surrounding this organization of hackers of doubtful chromatographic values, whether they're white or black or red or blue or green, should be very cautious about hanging on to what may turn into the biggest court case the world has ever seen, and convictions in respect of some of the deaths under the jurisprudence, if that's the right word, of the BBC. If you go to the central tunnel, of course, we've got essentially, I believe, a group of victims of the pedophile enforcement arm of the global patent for rent, murder for hire network, where they figure if they can get people in that loop who have been compromised in some way, maybe through drugs or whatever, or in prison, that involved the abuse of a child and the child died, they've been killed to keep them quiet. And of course, we don't have time to go into the details there, but should we just close on the top skyline? Because I think there's some very, very interesting lessons there, Jason.
Sure.
So what we have here is on the left-hand side of the building complex, that's the Boeing headquarters in Chicago, which was commissioned and activated on the 4th of September of 2001, the same day that Robert Mueller was sworn in as director of the FBI, there having been a hiatus between the resignation of Louis Frey, I think in May of 2001, June, July, August, about 3 or 4 months, when the FBI was headless. That is to say, assuming that the top of the head of the FBI would have the best understanding of what J. Edgar Hoover described as the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists. Well, the head of the FBI, that was J. Edgar Hoover, would be in the best position probably to get a feel for a conspiracy on the scale of something that would result in the possibility of a NATO AWACS aircraft being switched through a simulated continuity of government exercise to a live fire event where it steered these remotely controlled Boeing aircraft towards their target when the blue team responders had been stood down through virtue of having their certificates revoked on public key infrastructure. So now you have the potential for a second plane to hit the south face of the South Tower, which should have told America immediately that they were under attack, not just by a rogue guy straddling a yak in a cave in Afghanistan, who, according to the 911 Commission report, Chapter 11, said there was no red team planning to counter the probability or the challenge for a conspirator to find pilots who could fly planes, right, on 911. Well, the reason why there was no red team discovery or empathy for that is because the red team, possibly, I'm not accusing him, but the red team leader of the White Hats may have been lulled into the position where he was so overconfident or so neglectful or negligent, he left the door open for the Boeing aircraft to be switched from a continuity of government exercise to live fire events where at the various crime scenes 3,000 people died, in which case he's got a terrible challenge, A, for his conscience, and B, for his integrity. Over to you.
Well, David, it takes me back to the inherent conflict, the paradox, where if a highly respected NATO general gives you an order to do something, and you're a military man who's built his career and has been psychologically conditioned to take orders and not insubordinate, your concept of what's ethical is to listen to whatever you're told to do. This is sort of, I think, perhaps the way the military removes the concept of culpability or guilt from people carrying out orders, because someone telling someone to go do something is not the same as doing it themselves, and someone doing something that they're told is not the same as coming up with a plan yourself and doing it. So it's this sort of removal of culpability. It almost, David, speaks to another concept that you brought to my attention in remarkable coincidence with the time that Mr. Swigert made a video about it, but it's this breaking of the chain of custody. You know, if I plan to do something and then I go do it, well, that's fully my responsibility. But if I am compelled to do whatever another person tells me to do for the greater good of the United States and everyone in it, and that person tells me to do something that I object to, what do? You just have to do it.
Right, and I think that logic applies to the prison system in the United States, which is a hierarchical controlling type. So if you just look at that skyline again, what I think you've done brilliantly, Jason, is to demonstrate the intriguing notion that the people who put explosives in the Twin Towers and building number 7, which would have been an expert crew that quite possibly had some criminal records, once they've done that and their job is done, they've got to hightail it out of the area so they're not associated with the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers. So maybe we could close with that wonderful picture. That's the JPATS aircraft, the Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation aircraft, nicknamed Con Air, that's fleeing the scene, for all I know, loaded up with the Joint Automated Booking System passengers, JABS having been developed by Nortel Network Government Solutions for the Department of Justice. And what we're showing figuratively there, I guess, is your real expert terrorist. You get the hell out of the crime scene. You send in your scrubbers to take, care of anyone who might be making a few questions, is how do these steel frame buildings come down through fire, and why are the molten steel pools in the debris pile of buildings 1, 2, and 7 when building number 7 wasn't hit by a plane? So I think Christine Marcy, one day, she may not appear on your show, Jason, but appear perhaps in a court. I think she's been in a court with her brother, looking very nervous.
Really?
She was there with her girlfriend, Leonora Guaria.
In the court with Field?
Yeah, because Field was what was the case? He was trying to get a qui tam suit heard, and she came along because it involved money moving through the Small Business Administration. But she was in court with her girlfriend, Leonora Guaria, who very interestingly was the chief operating officer of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which had a floor of building number 7 shared with the Small Business Administration, which would have given the two women a bird's eye view of what Dr. Thomas Barnett described as the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history. Over to you.
Yeah, and of course, that's the event that you and I speak about so often, September 11th. David, we're just about out of time. I do want to remind everyone watching that they can follow you on Twitter at CSI Hawkins. David's posting quite frequently, and you can follow him there. Don't miss his website, Reverse CSI Scripts. David's got a playlist of all the videos that we do. I'm sorry, David, I haven't updated in a little while, but the playlist is, I will update it with the newer videos, and you can go back and watch. I know it's quite complicated, some of the things that we discuss, so people are going to find it, I think, helpful to maybe go to reversecsiscripts.com and follow the playlist here. David, next time I think we should look a little more into this DigiStamp company. It's now called the e-timestamp data authentication. And this was, I didn't know about this before, or at least I don't recall ever seeing it or talking about it, but this was in that press release having to do with Luxembourg and our favorite ethical hacker. I also want to remind people that they should visit patreon.com/reverse CSI Storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. David and I are doing subscriber only videos on Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. David, thank you so much for joining me today. It was another fascinating episode. I think we're just getting closer and closer to the truth, sharpening the point, and understanding some of these things that seemed so bizarre and inexplicable to a greater degree each week.
I think you're right. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on.
Thanks for watching, everybody.
Yeah, bye, Jason.